Alright, so this is the last section of the screencast. I need you to finish watching and taking notes on this for class tomorrow, okay? We left off discussing the Declaratory Act with Lord Rockingham as Prime Minister of Parliament. But Rockingham will eventually resign after too many people complain that he's a little lax and goes easy on the colonies. So he's going to be replaced by Charles Townshend as the new Prime Minister. And Charles Townshend relates much more so to Grenville's approach in the colonies. He has no sympathy for the colonies, so he pretty much immediately asks Parliament to declare the Townshend Acts, which, yes, he named after himself, so it kind of shows you how he's a little bit egotistical. But the Townshend Acts placed a tax on paper, paint, glass, and tea that were imported into the colonies. So the Townshend Acts placed different taxes on paper, paint.
Lauren Morris, call 250. Lauren Morris, call 250.
Yes, I'm still recording at school. So the Townshend Acts places a tax on imports such as paper, paint, glass, and tea. So the colonies are going to resist this again. They do not like Parliament becoming too controlling of them, and they still feel they are not being represented in Parliament. So again, there is another boycott of British goods. So the colonies are resisting with the boycott. Also, the Sons of Liberty, that radical group I just mentioned earlier, they're kind of back to their old tricks of protesting very radically, using methods such as tarring and feathering. And what I want you to know about colonial resistance is that the center point and the center colony that's kind of in the middle of all this resistance and uprising against Britain, especially the active kind, is Boston, Massachusetts. So Boston is kind of the hotbed and focal point of any patriot activity. Parliament will again compromise with the colonies once a new Prime Minister comes into power. I don't want you to stress about which Prime Minister is which right now. We're gonna get through that, but just make sure you understand and you're writing down when I'm mentioning the changing of Prime Minister to Prime Minister. But the new Prime Minister, and he's going to remain for a long time, is Oliver North, and he's known as Lord North. Lord North comes into power of Parliament as the Prime Minister, and when he is Prime Minister, the British merchants were suffering because of all of the boycotts that were happening in the colonies. So he is asked to repeal the Townshend Acts, and he is going to agree to do so. He removes taxes from all items except for tea. So Lord North will remove all taxes except for the tea. And I just want you to kind of see again how we're on this roller coaster of the colonies being upset with their king and Parliament, and Parliament kind of making up for it, but then, you know, putting more restrictions on them, and they were kind of just bantering back and forth here. So all of this is going to come to a head in the event, many of us, well, we all know it, the Boston Massacre. And we're going to talk about the actual picture you see. I would encourage you to analyze this picture. It's a poster of the event that was made by Sam Adams, and it's a piece of propaganda, and I'll explain why in class tomorrow. Remind me that we need to look at this. This is pretty interesting. But as I said earlier, Boston's kind of the center of the tension between the colonists and the British troops. But what we have always learned about the Boston Massacre, maybe in middle school and stuff, isn't necessarily true. So I want to give you kind of the straightforward background as to what we know happened at the Boston Massacre historically. So Boston was the center of tension, and on March 5th, colonists started to egg the Boston British troops on. They were taunting the British troops. They were jeering at them. They were kind of calling them names. They were throwing snowballs at them. So they're definitely harassing the British troops in Boston. So we know after this, or during this happening, a British soldier's gun did go off. But we do not know if it was intentional. It could have been an accident, but it definitely went off. We don't know if it was on purpose or by mistake, but as a reaction, because it threw off the other British soldiers, they started shooting into the crowd. So that's how the actual shots went off, okay? 5 colonists were killed as a result of this. If you remember the John Green video we watched on Tuesday, he kind of jokes it was probably the most unmassacre massacre that ever happened, because only 5 people died. But the name that you do need to know of one of the people who died was Crispus Attucks. And he actually was a fugitive slave, but was a known patriot. And the reason he is so important is because he's the first to be killed, at least as far as we know, in this massacre. Therefore, he is considered, Crispus Attucks is considered the first person to be killed in the Revolution. Now remind me, I want to talk about this poster tomorrow. This is just pictures of the memorial for the Boston Massacre in Boston, Massachusetts today. And this is the grave of the remains of those who were killed. Okay, now we're gonna quickly talk about the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So a little bit of background on the Tea Act. The British East India Company, which was a trading company, okay, the British East India Company, was in financial trouble. So, since they are a British company, Parliament is going to try to help them out. And in 1773, Parliament will pass the Tea Act. Now, the purpose of the Tea Act was that it gave the British East India Company advantages within the colonial tea market. Meaning, the purpose of the act was that it made the prices a little bit more affordable for the colonists if they specifically were to purchase British East India Company tea. Now let's think about that for a second, because it's kind of confusing. I'm saying that technically it's making the price of tea cheaper. So wouldn't the colonists like that? Well, some of the colonists probably would like cheaper tea. But unfortunately, this is giving British East India Company merchants the advantage over merchants actually living in the colonies. So they're the ones who are really mad about this, because no longer is their item being bought as much. So it does anger a lot of colonists. So the Sons of Liberty, our radical group led by Sam Adams, they're going to be the ones who try to respond to this very actively. They try to prevent East India Company ships from being able to dock in the Boston Harbor. Okay, they try to prevent East India Company ships from docking in the Boston harbor. Because if you couldn't dock, you couldn't unload the tea, and you couldn't sell it. So they basically tried to blockade them out. But one ship is eventually able to dock in the Boston harbor, and you've heard the story, you know how the Sons of Liberty are going to respond. They will disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians. No one really knows exactly why they decided to dress as Indians, but they tried to dress as Mohawk Indians. They snuck onto the ship, and they poured approximately 45 tons of tea into the Boston harbor. That's a lot of tea. And that becomes known as the Boston Tea Party. So the last thing that we're going to cover today, so in our last section, and we'll get through pretty much the rest tomorrow, is the coercive acts. And the coercive acts are also known as the intolerable acts, as cannot be tolerated, intolerable. The coercive acts are completely a punishment for the colonies. Well, when I say colonies, I'm talking about specifically Boston and Massachusetts. It's a punishment for Boston because of the Boston Tea Party. So King George III wants to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. So he does this with the coercive acts, also known as the intolerable acts, and there are 4 parts I need you to know about the intolerable acts, or coercive. The Port Bill. The first specification of the intolerable acts was that it closed the Boston harbor until the tea was paid for. So until they make up for all the tea that they have ruined and wasted, the Boston harbor would be closed. The second specification, the Government Act, specified that Massachusetts would now be placed under a military government known as martial law. So now the military will be completely responsible for running Massachusetts instead of any kind of colonial legislature. So the citizens and the colonists living in Massachusetts are just losing more and more power. The third specification was the Quartering Act. And in the Quartering Act, colonists again had to provide food and shelter for even more British soldiers than they had to before, because you know King George is now sending over more soldiers to monitor Boston, Massachusetts. The last part would be the Justice Act. And the Justice Act stated that trials for any royal officials, including British troops, trials for any royal officials could be transferred to England instead of being tried in the colonies. So it said that trials for any royal official living in the colonies could be transferred to England instead of being tried in the colonies themselves. This is just kind of a slap in the face saying, we're going to try them back home where they could potentially be shown favor, especially if there was any kind of crime they committed against the colonists. The colonists would have rather them be tried in the colonies themselves, but this is just another way to knock them. Okay, so we are at the point in the notes where the First Continental Congress is going to convene, but that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. So make sure you listen to this more than once if you need to fully understand the notes. And as always, write down any questions that you had while taking the notes, and we'll cover them tomorrow. Okay, perfect timing. Class dismissed.